My father is Polish, and I am the great-granddaughter of Aleksander Sulkiewicz.
And Aleksander Sulkiewicz is the person over
Yes. And I came to Łódź because I always knew that the Robotnik was printed here. And my good friend, who does a lot of my genealogy, lives here. And he said, well, why don't we come over and visit while you're here? So we came over, and everyone was so excited to find out I was the great-granddaughter of Aleksander Sulkiewicz. The Sulkiewicz family is actually a Tatar family, and I've always been interested in their history. And I know that my great-grandfather was a great patriot and a close friend of Józefem Piłsudskim. And in fact, in our family lore, he was apparently the godfather of my grandmother, Zofia Sulkiewicz. She was the oldest one, and she married my grandfather in 1922, Józef Makowski, who was a pilot. He knew Valery Slavic, and there's a story that when he was a boy, he was shooting at a family's estate in the Ukraine, and he was trying to cock the gun, and Valery Slavic came up. Don't ever do that, because if you look at me, you see what happened to me, and you know how Valery Slavic had severe injuries from the famous train robbery. And also when he married my grandmother, my grandfather got very involved in the Polish politics of the time. The other sister, Helena, she went to university in Łódź, and she became a biology teacher. And she married an officer who died I think in the early 40s, when the war started. And then Witold was the youngest, and he became an Ulan. He became a cavalry officer, and he was part of a regiment when the war broke out. But he got captured and spent maybe 6 years in a prisoner of war camp. We always heard stories growing up about the Piłsudski family. And my grandmother knew both wives, actually. And she was fond of the first wife, but not so fond of the second wife. My father can remember as a young boy that I think my father was born in 1930, and how he would go and have tea with the Piłsudskis in Warsaw.
Then it had to be the second wife.
With a second wife, yes. Yes.
And do you know how Aleksander Sulkiewicz met Józef Piłsudski, or when?
I don't know specifically, but if you look at the dates of his life and the things that he was doing, it must have been in Vilnius.
So in the 19th century?
Yes, probably around 1897 to 1899. And my great-grandfather, who was Muslim, was the customs officer. And he was responsible for having the Robotnik sent to different places. And many people think it's because he was Muslim that the authorities wouldn't have thought that he would be involved in conspiracy.
Okay, but as far as I know, Aleksander was working on the border of the Prussian and Russian Empire.
I think that was early on, wasn't it?
Maybe yes. But what was he doing later? Do you know?
Well, apparently he was the one who got Piłsudski out of the prison in St. Petersburg. I'm not quite sure what he did afterwards, but he died in 1916 in the Battle of Stockholm, defending Poland.
And does your family know what kind of person he was?
Well, the fact that he died, my grandmother was 16, but not really about his kind of person, but I've done some reading, and everyone, I think it was Adam Koch who wrote about him, who said that he was a devout patriot. And he was very fervent about it, like very, very committed to the cause. And he had 3 children, and they moved, I think around 1900, back to Poland from Vilnius. My grandmother was born in 1900. And my grandmother spent most of her childhood in Krakow and Zakopane. They always preferred southern Poland because it was under the Austrian Empire, is that right? And it was actually a more freer, safer place. Whereas when she told me that when they were close to Russia, it was much more dangerous. My grandmother tells me that they were always ready to escape.
And were they also involved into this work?
Not my grandmother, but her mother was. My father even tells a story about how his grandmother would take the robotnik and hide it in her skirts and go out and distribute it to people.
How did it happen that you are American?
Well, that's very interesting. So 1939 is a famous date for all of us. My grandfather, it was dangerous for them to be in Poland, and he was director of Polish Airlines, and he sent his, my father had 1 sister, and she was studying in France at the time when the bombing came. And so my grandmother and my father escaped through Italy and ended up in England, and the sister came to meet them. And my grandfather, soon after, met them in England, and he became the first squadron leader of the first Polish squadron in England, Squadron 300. Then after the war, it was impossible for them to come back because of communism. And my grandfather worked for the United Nations in the Middle East. And then my father and his sister emigrated to Canada, where he met my mother. And then my father went to Harvard Business School in Boston. And that's where I was born.
In Boston, United States?
Yes.
Good. Okay. And do you speak Polish?
When I was a child, yes, because my grandparents, in the end, retired to Canada, and they had a farm outside Montreal, and I spent all my summers there speaking Polish. It's a very difficult language, and I spoke a lot of it, sort of conversationally, but after they died, it kind of dissipated.
And does your father speak Polish?
He speaks beautiful Polish.
Okay, so we've got something for him.
Ah.
And for you, if it will be possible for you to read. This is the book, Bibuła. The memoirs of Józef Piłsudski, written in 1903 in Krakow, where he writes about Aleksander Sulkiewicz, and this is the first issue with a huge commentary and with many appendixes also about Aleksander Sulkiewicz.
Wow, thank you so much. And we also have something for you.
Wow.
This is a picture of Aleksander Sulkiewicz, his wife Jadwiga, and this is my grandmother Zofia Sulkiewicz and her sister Helena, but Witold wasn't born until 1911.
Do you know where the photo was taken?
I'm not quite sure, but she must be about 5, I would say, in this picture. So it must be Krakow or Zakopane.
Okay, so probably southern Poland.
But it's interesting because you can see the sort of, you can see how my grandmother looks very Tartar.
Yes.
And this one doesn't. But it must have been sort of very interesting at the time that for a Catholic woman to marry a Muslim, the Catholic Church wouldn't marry them because they were kind of shocked about the whole thing. So when they got married, they were married in the Lutheran Church.
Where?
In Vilnius. And
when did it happen?
1899.
So is that the time when Józef Piłsudski
Yes. I don't think Piłsudski was at their marriage, but in our lore, apparently my grandmother is, as I said, the goddaughter. And I've come to Poland all my life at different times. You know, in the 70s when I was a young child, and then over the years. And I was lucky to meet a lot of the people who had known my grandparents from before the war. We kept close contact with our family and lots of family friends. And one lady, Mrs. Zahn, she said, oh, you know, the Piłsudskis and your great-grandparents, they were the greatest friends. I mean, there are many indications that they were very close. For instance, there's a Sulkiewicz street in Warsaw, near Belvedere, which Piłsudski had done after my great-grandfather died in 1916. And also, after my great-grandfather died, he came to his wife and he says, you know, your husband was such a great friend and all this. I want to give you some kind of pension. And she refused. She says, I don't take handouts. But she said, if you can help me start a business, I would be greatly appreciated. And I believe in Łódź, she began a tobacco business on her own from her house with the help of Piłsudski.
So maybe you can tell us something more about her. Do you know something?
No, I don't know a lot, except that she was apparently very severe, like very strong-minded and very severe. She lived until 1960, which is quite a long time. The only thing I really heard was her putting the robotnik under the skirts and handing them out. But she must have been a very strong woman because her husband, I know for a fact that her husband was away a lot. From my grandmother, I had the impression that he was always busy doing his activities and he was not in the home a lot. So she must have been a very strong woman to keep the household together.
Do you have any idea why?
I think there was a time also that my great-grandfather was in prison at some point in Warsaw. And for his conspiratorial activities. And apparently I think it was done by the Russians. But my grandmother never liked the Russians.
Did you hear in your family some stories about the other conspiracy workers, about the comrades from PPS? Or?
No, not really.
About Aleksander Malinowski, Kazimierz Rożnowski. You said about Valery Sławek, but it was much...
It's more to do with my grandfather, that story about Valery Sławek. I heard, there's a funny little story about Pristor. Do you know who I'm talking about? And my grandmother was at an important cocktail party in Warsaw. She was married, this is probably in the 30s. And Pristor came up to my grandmother and he said, Zofia? You're Zofia? Black Mayhow's daughter? She goes, yes. She goes, I remember when you were 3 years old and I was wearing a sort of Russian uniform and I looked over you in your crib and you socked me in the stomach. So that kind of, I think that says a lot about, not only about my grandmother, because she was probably the strongest woman I've ever met, that what it must have been like, even as that young an age, to be aware about what kind of danger they must have been in.
And, you said that she was the most powerful woman.
She was an incredible woman, yes.
Could you tell something more?
Well, you know, it wasn't easy. I mean, you know, they had this sort of very nice life in Warsaw. Her husband was director of law. Her family was well known, respected for their, you know, Piłsudski connection. And then the war came, right? And they are forced to flee. And I think the war years were hard, but it was after the war that was so difficult. Because, first of all, they couldn't go back to Poland. And then they had no my grandfather lost all his connection, he's lost everything, and they had to start all over again. And my father says the story about like all the Poles, because the Polish community in London was very, very strong. And she said everyone was like having a nervous breakdown, but my grandmother kept them all together. You know, she kept them, we're going to do something. And what they did is they rented a mushroom farm outside London, and all the Poles would come and they would like rent out rooms to the Poles, or would live there, and they would pick mushrooms and sell them, and they started their own little business, and they started all over again. That's how they started. Mm-hmm. And then after about 5 years, my grandmother said to her husband, she packed him a suitcase and she said, "Don't come back until you find a job." And he got a job with the United Nations as a technical advisor. So he too started all over again. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting growing up in this Polish community in Boston, because obviously a lot of my grandparents' friends were in the aviation, and a lot of them escaped to London. My grandfather's best friend, Bogdan Kwaszinski, I think he was the military air attaché. And then they all went to Montreal together because they spoke French as a second language. And the people they were playing bridge with in 1939, before the war, they were playing bridge with in 1975 in Montreal. And I think that's just such an amazing connection to have.
How do you feel visiting this museum and finding information about Aleksander Sulkiewicz?
Well, I mean, as you can imagine, for a great-granddaughter to have my grandfather, I mean, so well known, is very, I mean, it makes me quite proud. I mean, I could say in the United States, I'm a great-granddaughter of Aleksander Sulkiewicz, and people say, "Who's he?" But I can say it here, and people, "Oh, wow, you're his great-granddaughter." My expectation was, basically, I thought I would see what the Robotnik printing press would look like and what the paper would look like. And I thought there would be something about it, but I didn't expect to see the photo. And I love that. The fact that you know so much about him is really interesting.
Do you have this photo in your family archive?
No, we don't.
So is this the first time
The first time I've seen this photo, yes.
That's great.
Yeah, that was really, really great. And it's interesting because we have him, he's younger than the most photos that we have of him. He must be, he looks about 35, 40 in that picture, I would say. That must be around 1905. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so.
Okay, so we're proud and happy that we could deliver you something new.
Yes, it's very exciting, and I just love the way that you've done this. It's an absolutely beautiful museum.